Good afternoon. I'm Austin Davis, Director of Government Affairs with the Lake Champlain Chamber, your friendly local regional chamber of commerce with a knack for nurturing prosperity in our local economy. And this particular live at 525 broadcast, we're going to be talking about housing. And to talk about housing, I brought on Troy Bachman, who is the director of the Northwest Vermont Realtors Association. And she is really just, if you want to talk for an expert on our region's housing, you could find no better person at this point in time.
Wow,
but,
a huge compliment.
But, I don't think, unless you're living under a rock, it's not hard to see that there's some issues around housing in our region. And at the Chamber, we speak with many businesses every day. And it's really noticeable that it's the limiting factor in most of our economic endeavors. And really every pursuit. It's issues with staffing in our healthcare systems and other essential services. It's preventing growth of some businesses. And, we're seeing a lot of incredible things in our regional economy despite this. However, we could do much better, and we need to do much better. So I'm really happy to have Troy on the program here today to talk a little bit about, the state of play and some things we can look forward to. But thanks for joining. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the organization?
Sure. So thanks for having me on. As Austin mentioned, my name is Troy Bachman. I am the CEO of the Northwest Vermont Realtor Association. We are a trade association representing realtors. We've got about 700 members. And our service area is Chittenden, Franklin, and Grand Isle counties. So most of our realtors are serving that area. Of course, many of them do business throughout the state, and we are a part of a broader coalition of realtors across the nation. So our focus is really training for our members, education, and allowing them to provide the best service to clients. And with that requires some understanding of our market and what's happening with that. So glad to dive in and talk about, a little bit what's happening if you want to go into that.
Yeah, you sent me a really enlightening report a day or a couple days ago when we decided we're going to set this up. And just tell me a little bit about that. This is something you're doing on a regular basis and provide some great insight into what's happening in our market.
Sure. So I'm going to plug the Vermont Association of Realtors. They provide amazing market statistics for us through a firm called Domus Analytics, and this is available for all of our realtor members. So one of the reports that we see is about the median sales price, and we're always kind of looking at that. And we all know anecdotally that housing prices are going up, wages maybe not matching that, and that can be really challenging. So right now we see the median sales price across Vermont for all types of properties, so condos, land, single family, all types of residential properties is about $375,000. Now, when we zoom in on just Chittenden County, that number goes up. Which is not surprising. Like we're one of the biggest metropolitan areas in Vermont, and the median sales price in August 23 was $534,000. And that was just for single family homes. So we can see, and the graph you're seeing on our screen is tracking the median sales price over time. So you can see there are some dips every now and then, and that's natural with any type of free market, but we can see that that's going up and up and up, which has led to a lot of concern about how Vermonters are going to afford housing.
Certainly, and it's not as if it's an easy time. We're all seeing inflation across the board, not just in housing, eat away at wages, and we're at a time when student loans are resuming payment. What are some other factors at play for folks?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic caused sort of a nominal influx of people into Vermont. Other things at play is a historic shortage of building supply, and that's not just from the most recent sort of pandemic issues, but that stems all the way back to 2008. Like the recession, as if there were only one.
Yeah.
The one in 2008, the housing industry kind of screeched to a halt for a while in terms of building. So we're already working from a stunted supply. And so, it's not just a Vermont issue, it's a nationwide issue. So yeah, we've got the inflation, we've got student loans, a lack of supply, and then contributing to our supply issues, of course, is Act 250.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so there's obviously some things that are specific to Vermont too. We have a 50-year-old land use policy that hasn't seen much in the way of updates throughout its time. It was created at a time when we didn't have an agency of natural resources and very little local planning and zoning. So it certainly had a purpose at that time. We've only added to it ever since. And so I think that's something we'll probably want to get into in a little bit about some chances to reform it. We also have a really old housing stock in this state. Can you talk a little bit more about that? 'Cause I certainly live in one of those old houses.
Yeah, I mean, I live in a house from 1905, and again, that kind of stems from the challenges in development, the labor shortages of like finding people to work on your house if you can't do it yourself. Yeah, we definitely have an aging housing stock, and again, we can kind of look at some of the regulations, and that's not the only reason, but it certainly doesn't help in trying to generate new supply. And then another factor, again, we see this nationwide, but specifically in Vermont, is we have an older population, and people are living longer, more independently.
Staying in their homes
longer. And especially if you've locked in a 2.5 interest rate, or maybe you've paid off your house, maybe you don't have a mortgage payment at all, there's not a lot of incentive to move right now and downsize, because that's an issue that we see as well, of like, we do have an older person maybe looking to downsize, but where are they going? They don't have properties to downsize to.
Yeah, we really do have an issue with housing at the entry and exit point of the market. There are folks who are older, who are in larger homes that could probably be more suitable to young families. They might be empty nesters at this point. They're in retirement. And, they're, as you said, probably paid off the mortgage and whatnot. But it's hard to find something that actually makes sense for them if they're going to sell this home, to then put what equity they have in that and have some extra for retirement. That price that you put on the screen there, $425. Sure, they could sell their home, but where are they going to move to?
Where are they going to move to? Yeah, that is the question on everybody's mind. And I know for our members, a lot of people are having to kind of get creative with the housing options that they're helping people find. Like more and more, we're seeing young families buy multifamily, like duplexes and quadplexes when they can find them, and renting out part of that. And that's a wonderful option. And that middle housing point of like, it's not necessarily a single family home, but it's not a big apartment complex, is something that I think our market could really use more of. And it's already all through the downtown area. Like we already see it. And I think sometimes there's like resistance to the idea of let's put some duplexes or some quadplexes. But that already exists. It's just old.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong, I don't think, with building more of that.
One, it's a great place a great opportunity for the young professionals in the state to start building some equity and cementing some roots here. Two things that I think are very difficult for this generation, especially with an older population in our state.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody watching this. I'm not from around here. I'm from the South. I moved up last summer, and part of the conversation, you alluded to this in your opening, was like my association I had to work remotely for a while I tried to find housing, and with a aging population and inflation increasing and causing the dollar to go further, taxpayers are often on the hook for that. So all the nice services we get for our taxpayer dollars, we need more people here in order to keep the tax burden where it is, as opposed to increasing that.
And I think that's an important point. I mean, I think much of our conversation around development of new housing in our state has consistently been one about growth and an underlying idea that growth is bad. And I think we're at a point where, especially because we've suppressed growth for so many years, we absolutely need growth. Without growth, we're going to collapse. We're not, right now, 1 in 5 Vermonters is over 65. It's coming soon to 1 in 4. And, you're not going to have the hospital staff, the emergency staff, the folks who can work on these old houses if we don't do something and do something soon. And then also, we're not going to have the tax base to support all the services these older folks need. So growth is necessary, and we're not seeing new units come online. And I think you had some data on that too, or no?
I can talk about the months of supply. Sorry.
Yeah.
So right now our market has about 2.1 months supply of inventory, which means it would take 2.1 months for us to sell anything residential that is on the market. That doesn't account for new construction. That's like what is existing. But the sort of thought of a healthy market, depending on like where you are in the nation, is anywhere from like a healthy housing market has 4 to 6 months at least on the market. And the numbers aren't lying. Like, we've only got 2 months, which can be kind of scary, right? Because if you're a realtor or you're someone looking for a house, it feels very nerve-wracking to be like, okay, well, this is what we have. There's probably not anything new coming on in the next 24 hours or whatever. So there's the pressure on first-time home buyers, the pressure on people looking to find something a little different for their housing needs is really high.
And it really is all housing needs too. Really what we're talking about is when we're at that level of inventory, just slowing down all turnover and all churn in the market, right?
Right.
And so, we're even talking about our folks who are unhoused in our state. And I think actually our state treasurer, I'll give him credit where credit's due, he had this fantastic webinar not long ago, and the title of it was based off of a book whose author he came on in, homelessness is a housing problem, which I think is something that's extremely lost on a lot of individuals in this current debate.
Yeah, I mean, and we can't forget the connection that homelessness has with like general poverty. And again, we're seeing this as a wage issue as well, of like, we've got a shortage of people to fill jobs. We've got a shortage of, again, it just all comes back to like, we do need people here, but the problem is we have nowhere to put them.
Yes.
And the big question is, how are we going to solve that issue? Which, you and I talk a lot about this, but like, we're not going to build our way out of it. There's going to have to be some other reforms to support the market, other than just like, the solution is not build new housing. Like, that is not the end all be all solution. It has to be one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, so let's talk about reforms of our housing.
Sure.
I mean, I think we touched on Act 250 a while back and earlier in the conversation. And what we found is, this is a land use law that has stymied growth for 50 years, and to a large extent has kind of accomplished what it set out to not do, which is create sprawl. And I think, for me, when I think about the epitome of that, it comes down to what's called the 10-5-5 rule. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the 10-5-5 rule is a portion of the legislation that says you can only build 10 houses within 5 years within 5 miles of each other. So when you think about like a traditional suburban neighborhood, that's typically more than 10 houses. And we don't have a lot of those here. And it's not necessarily houses, it's like 10 units.
Yeah.
So I know there was a proposal to bump that number up to 25. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how that played out, but
I think that was really scary for a lot of folks, and I think we ended up, getting something across the finish line in the legislative processes last session that allowed to go to 25 or 24 in limited areas. We're talking about 0.5% of the state's overall land mass. And I think we need to go much bigger and bolder than that if we're going to start hitting our targets. And you think about that from an incentive perspective. And when you say you can't do more than 10 units within 5 years, within 5 miles, unless you're automatically going into Act 250 if you don't. And, Act 250 is notorious for adding additional time, energy, and cost.
So I was looking into this a little bit as someone sort of new to the area within the last year or so, and I found there was a number, granted this is from 2017, so many years old at this point in terms of the rate of inflation, but it said that an Act 250 review process could add up to, if not more than $50,000 to the cost of the home. Wow. And that prices out so many people, you know, like, especially with the interest rates that we're seeing right now, like the $50,000 extra dollars is the difference between, I'm not the mathematician here, let's be clear. But that's like a significant difference in your monthly mortgage payment and your down payment. Like,
and your tax bill.
And your tax bill, yeah.
I think anyone who's ever bought a home can tell you the difference between, what that $50,000 can make.
Yeah.
And, that certainly just gets rolled into the overall long-term price of rental units too.
Yep.
And so all of it, does go back to this. But back to my incentives point, if you know that you might be adding $50,000 per unit on this project, you're going to try to avoid that. You're going to try to get that market rate lower. And so what you're telling a developer is, tell you what, build 9 units and then maybe wait 5 years.
And then we'll talk.
And we'll talk again. Or go 5 miles down the road.
Right.
So, what we've really seen, and I think, you talk to a lot of, I remember I was working at the Center for Research of Vermont many years ago. And one study they did was they asked Vermonters, describe sprawl.
I was going to ask you, I feel like we need to define what that is, because we know what that is, but for the purposes of this conversation, put a definition on it.
Yeah, and the funny thing was a lot of folks, once they define sprawl, they'd be asked, is your community sprawling? And a lot of the folks in these our local communities would say no. And then they'd kind of go back and say, well, by your definition, we do have sprawl. And I think that it's these little pockets of acreage that provide, the agrarian feeling lifestyle that folks move to Vermont for, many folks do. That doesn't necessarily feel like sprawl, but when you take a larger step back, you realize, my home on a dirt road at the end of another dirt road is contributing to the sprawl at the end of the day.
Well, and an important factor of all this too is Act 250, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, was designed with some environmental concerns in mind. And sprawl is not environmentally friendly, right? If you're in a community, if you live at the end of a dirt road, you have to get in a car and drive wherever you're going. You're not necessarily taking public transportation. You're not walking to the grocery store that's 15 miles away, right? So you're contributing to your carbon footprint goes up. And I would argue that sprawl has a big factor in carbon emissions, right? Because you got to have a car.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to, and then on the other side of things, it's expensive to develop in our downtowns.
Sure. That's
where the majority of the regulatory burden is. A lot of the sites in our downtowns need to be some kind of remediated. They're brownfields, which means at one point in time, there was some kind of contamination of that soil. So you need to mitigate that before you ever start. And it's just difficult to actually build in our downtowns. And that leads back to each of our organizations' respectively long-term goal, which is removing some of these downtowns from Act 250 jurisdiction. The ones that have shown that they have rigorous regulatory environments that can handle the work of Act 250, the work that wasn't done by any municipality when Act 250 was created. They can handle it, and they can do it at a local level, which ironically is a bit of a Vermont value, but we don't allow it often. I think I'm excited to see a couple of studies that are going on. There's And I'm curious what your thoughts of looking at the progression. But currently, right now, due to a bill that passed last year, Act 47, there are 4 separate studies going on. And I urge anyone watching to plug into these. The Natural Resources Board is undertaking a study, and they're looking at so many factors I don't think it's worth listing. But what they're coming out to is and what it might look like is a tiered system where communities, based off the place, based off of their regulation, municipalities are going to see different levels of review. We might actually be able to see downtowns like Burlington be able to do their own review and operate on their own, still acknowledging all the criteria and whatnot of Act 250, but doing it at their local level. And then I think there's going to be some areas in the state that will likely look a lot like Act 250 currently is, with some revisions. And then I think there will be some areas in the state that folks will actually increase jurisdictional thresholds. And ironically, those are areas that Act 250 was always meant to protect and maybe didn't do the best job protecting. Some of these places in more vulnerable areas. We're talking about really about 18% of the state. So that's a really exciting kind of component of how the Natural Resources Boards using their time. And then there's a designation study, which I believe the website is designation2050.org. If you want to take a look at that, we can post that in the description of this video. There's a summit next week on Tuesday, and there's some other opportunities to engage. But this is about the designation programs for different cities and towns across the state that allow for revitalization and tax credits for things like mixed-use development and flood mitigation, which is very, very on the tip of our tongues this summer. And they're looking at how do they make those designations have a little bit more oomph. How can we look at places like Burlington and say, okay, actually the fact that they've achieved this designation means that maybe they don't need Act 250, or places like Winooski that's had tremendous, fantastic, smart growth over the last few years. It's really opportunity city for Vermont. And then, the other 2 things, I don't know, kind of stop being so long-winded about it, but is just some advanced planning.
I was going to, I'll jump in and say that while I don't think a lot of the consequences of the regulation that we have currently were intentional, we are going to have to be extremely intentional with how we rectify our issues. We're going to have to take these studies and do something with the information, because you see this all the time of like, okay, well, like, let's get some information, let's get some data on that. Great. And then it gets kind of pushed down what
do we do with that data?
Yeah.
Let's make more data out of it.
Right. And I think it's so important to take, okay, yes, we know this is an issue. We now have the numbers to prove that this is an issue. Let's be very intentional with how we do this in an inclusive way that provides more access for people who've traditionally been knocked out of the housing market.
And I think that's what's exciting about some of the work that's been mandated this last session for the Vermont Association of Planners and Development Agencies. And what they're looking at is mapping the state, which I think was always kind of one of the original goals under Act 250. That just kind of got forgotten. It was one of those
it's a big piece of legislation, easy to forget things.
No, well, it was one of those things. Is always the intention, but it should be easy to look at a map somewhere and say, okay, these are volatile areas. These are sensitive ecological areas. Don't touch them. These are areas that have stormwater and sewer water and fantastic electrical utilities and public transit. These are places we should put development.
Exactly.
And once we have some of that, inventorying of our resources as a state, my hope is we can have more educated conversations, and we can actually make much of this conversation place-oriented and realistic in its expectations. So you can kind of see how these 3 studies that I mentioned are all kind of braiding together. And the hope is that, before December even, we have a nice idea of how they've all braided together. and we can use the work of the planners and developing agencies, and we can use the work of the existing designation programs and how folks want to re-envision that, and then put that into how the Natural Resources Board wants to handle some locations. And we can start to have it so that we can build more housing in the places that it needs to be.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember and to remind ourselves and everyone, nobody wants us to build lock, stock, and barrel, no holds barred, wherever you want to build, you can build. Like, nobody wants that, right? Well, somebody probably does want that.
There's people who want that.
There are people who want
But
that.
they're not on this show.
They're not on this show.
For a reason.
But I think it's important to, like, the concept of there's going to be new housing near my house. What does that mean for traffic? What does that mean for the crowding at my grocery store? What does that mean for my daily life?
What does that mean for my backyard?
What does that mean for my backyard? And we need more people, not to be a total cornball, but like we need more people to say, yes, I want this here, because it does have benefit for everyone. And living in that community, living in a community that is more connected is good for people. Our association did a polling project, and it wasn't in Chittenden County, it was in Franklin and Grand Isle, where we asked registered voters about their preferences and, you know, what type of housing do you want to see developed? And it was clear that there's tension between, like, yes, I see that housing cost and housing availability is an issue, but I don't want it here.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big barrier, especially in the Act 250 process because of the public comment and public review process.
And really, you know, I think the thing we haven't even hit on here is that Act 250 does create this just war of attrition. It's about how long can you drag it out. But the longer you drag it out, the more you're adding costs. Yeah. Because, you know, with enough time and patience, most people can get through Act 250.
At what point do you give up, though? You know, if you face barriers.
Well, I think the issue with Act 250 when we talk to legislators is there is that question of, like, what point do you give up? And it's, you know, the people point to we don't see many people give up. Most Act 250 permits go through to completion, and it's like, at what cost?
Literally, that was the thing I was going to say, was at what cost.
The second side of that is who never tried, because they've seen that cost. They've seen that time and energy expended. And they said, not worth it.
And if you're a developer, I think another, you know, speaking of cost, I don't have the hard data on this, but I would assume that if you are a developer looking at, okay, I can build 24, let's just say we bump it up to 2555. I can build 24 units. That's going to change how you cost your materials. It's going to change how you cost your contractors. Like, it does. The buy in bulk mentality is not always the best, but it does I mean, it is part of the conversation, you know, of, okay, but if I had to start at 9, take a pause, do 9 again, like, it's, I think that's a,
well, we're coming up at 2 minutes, and so I want to get your final thoughts, but I want to put a finer point on what we were kind of just getting at, and that is, you know, what we need is Vermonters to start looking at the current housing situation with a less myopic lens. And what we need folks to look at is that we do need some growth. We have pushed back growth to try to stay to our agrarian bucolic roots as long as possible. However, we're at a point of emergency. We're not going to have the nurses and doctors, or the EMTs or firefighters, or the teachers,
or even the baristas and the servers, or anybody.
We're not going to have them if we don't do something, and do something soon. You know, we need everyone to start looking at it that way. And you know, if you would like to plug into these efforts, my email is just austin@vermont.org, and I don't know if you want to share yours.
Sure, mine is troy@nwvtrealtor.org.
And certainly want to plug you in. Reach out to your legislators. Let them know that housing is an issue of concern for you, and that you want to be a welcoming state, a state that says, come here, do great things, join our community. Because to say no to housing is to say no to new Vermonters at the end of the day. Is there anything else you want to leave us with? It's been a fantastic
Gosh, well, that
conversation.
really, you said it better than I can. But yeah, I'll just give a plug for definitely it is important to be engaged with all aspects of your community. And at this point, broad housing goals is what builds our community, right? We want people to feel included here, and that's something I certainly love about Vermont. That's something that made Vermont really attractive to me and my family. Was it seems like a welcoming place, and so let's make that true with our housing. And you've got to engage with your legislators and kind of keep an eye on that. And that's probably what I would say.
Nothing says you're welcome here like a healthy housing inventory.
Hey, you know what? That's exactly right. Let's change our slogan.
So let's leave it at that for today. Again, I'm Austin Davis with the Lake Champlain Chamber, and thank you, Troy, for joining for this.
Thanks for having me.
And have a great evening, folks.